This is London.
On the 24th of December 1928, 60 years ago today, the distant voice of a single boy treble began a Christmas service of words and music, being broadcast for the first time from the chapel of King's College in Cambridge. This festival of 9 lessons and carols, now recreated in churches all over the world, had been put together 10 years earlier, just 6 weeks after the armistice, by the Dean of King's, Eric Milner White. The plan was simple: to follow the story of our redemption in a series of lessons, read in ascending order, if you like, from a boy chorister to the provost of the college, each lesson being followed by a carol or two associated with its message. Well, 25 years ago today, I was experiencing my first Christmas at King's, singing in the choir as a choral scholar, and I know full well the tremendous hold that King's has over the hearts and minds of those who've been a part of it. The Reverend Pat McGee was also a choral scholar, and later chaplain, and even earlier a boy chorister. In fact, he read the chorister's lesson on that first broadcast back in 1928. Unlike most small boys these days, he kept a diary, and he still has it.
The 24th, Monday, and this is what I have written in pencil. Christmas Eve. Practice 10 till 12:45. Go out to dinner with Mum and Dad. Carol service broadcasted. Comes off well. I read the lesson and sing a solo in lullaby.
What a typically factual account of what must have been an extraordinary event in the life of a small boy in those early days of broadcasting. It's hard to imagine the feelings of a wider audience suddenly able to enjoy that service without actually being there.
Most of the comments would be made as how well they heard it, because in those early days of broadcasting, you see, some things didn't go very well. Our first broadcast ever was an awful mess, for instance.
For what reason?
They hadn't got the acoustics, you see. It was a series of crashes, and that must have been about a year and a half earlier. It was an evensong on a Sunday.
I've always assumed that the great crowds that flock to King's on Christmas Eve come because it is now an international institution. Was it always like that?
It wasn't an international institution in the early days, but it was very much a Cambridge institution. And I can remember crowds queuing round the court from a very early age, and I can remember my mother and father wanting to come and wondering how they were going to manage to get in.
That's even before it had been broadcast?
That was before it was broadcast, yes. It was already, as it were, a great event in Cambridge.
It's a marvellous
Then
thing.
I think really, of course, the thing that really put it on the map was the war. I recall being in the Far East in one Christmas, the last Christmas, in which an officer, not really at all religious, said, "There's a wonderful service you must listen to at 3 o'clock in the morning," or something, you see, we were at the other end of the world. And it was amazing the number of people who got up to hear it, and the effect it had. I think it said something special. Here was something we really stand for.
Well, thanks to the continued broadcasting of the service, every year except 1930, in what has become a tradition as well established as the Queen's speech, there must be millions of people all over the world with similar thoughts, and I certainly can't remember ever feeling that Christmas had really begun until I heard that boy's voice, angelic in its message and crystal clear in its sound. And yet crystal clarity must have come in only gradually over the decades. The first 10 years were notable simply because the broadcasts actually took place, and the techniques presumably improved with each transmission. But there must have been problems in the early days. The war years must have been particularly difficult. There were planes flying overhead, and all the glorious glass of the chapel was removed for safekeeping. Frank Anderson produced the Christmas Eve service for over 40 years for the BBC, and remembers a particular hazard at that time.
During one of the war years, we couldn't even get the side chapel, which we normally use for as a control point, and we had to take one of the ones further west on the north side of the chapel, which is open right out onto the chapel, with the result that the wretched engineer, in those days it was a man called Colin Begbie, had to do his balance on headphones. He couldn't even have a loudspeaker to listen to. And I remember that had a disastrous result because we had our radio on, and the service overran and had to take Kings off. And suddenly the old bull and bush was blasting out into the chapel from where we were.
We can only hope that it didn't reach the ears of the director of music. During the Second World War, that was Harold Darke, most affectionately remembered for his carol In the Bleak Midwinter. He was standing in for Boris Ord, who was away on active service. Boris Ord, in turn, succeeded Dr. A.H. Mann. Daddy Mann, as he was affectionately known, wrote the familiar harmonisation of Once in Royal David's City, which traditionally begins the service, and was organist at King's for over 50 years. The turnover in directors of music is not very great. Stephen Cleobury is only the 6th this century. But boy choristers, of course, come and go more quickly, and many of them stay with music for the rest of their lives. But some believe that they've done their bit when their voices break and opt for something else. John Pardoe, for example, who tussled with David Steele for the leadership of the Liberal Party back in the late 70s, was a chorister during the war years, and told me what conditions were like during those dark days.
Well, of course, they were very different because we were in not quite the worst part of the war, but blackout was still the thing. All the King's windows were out. The whole place was completely black. I don't think it had ever been cleaned since it was built, and so you never saw any fan vaulting, and all you saw were these marvellous circles of light hovering around the top of the candlesticks. And you see, even during the day it was blackout as well, because there just were no windows.
That was just for safety, I guess, was it?
Well, they'd been taken out and buried somewhere in the fens, I imagine, and we were always told they'd been buried away so the Germans couldn't get them.
You were there at the same time as both Harold Darke and Boris Ord.
I went there when Harold Darke, Dickie Darke as we all called him, marvellous old man. He seemed incredibly old then, even though it's his 100th anniversary of his birth this year. He was the quintessential caricature of the musician. He had these marvellous wispy grey hairs, and he was very kind and very considerate, and everybody loved him.
Did it make you sing well?
I think he got very good results. I don't think the quality deteriorated. I'm not sure of it, but I don't think so. And he came with a very good reputation. And of course, we loved his music, remember? I mean, In the Bleak Midwinter, which was a wonderful thing. I mean,
everybody loves it.
Everybody loved that. And I played it on Desert Island Discs back in 1976. And I got that wonderful letter from him in a marvellous old man's scribbly handwriting saying, thank you for playing it.
In the bleak midwinter, frosty wind made moan. Earth stood hard as iron, water like a stone. Snow had fallen, snow, snow, snow. In the bleak midwinter,
When Boris Ord came, did things change a bit?
Yeah, didn't like Boris.
Why not?
He was a cruel, sadistic so frankly. There were people who liked him, and I suppose his colleagues at King's probably got on well with him at high table, but choristers did not get on well with Boris. I don't know anybody who liked him.
But was that a disciplinary thing, do you
He
think?
wasn't a kind man. He took sadistic delight in choristers making mistakes.
And yet on Christmas Eve, in spite of all that, you still have to sound like angels.
Yes, wonderful results. But in a funny kind of a way, King's produces those results, doesn't it?
Well, yes and no. Each successive director of music has certainly made his own mark on proceedings at King's. In my day, it was Sir David Willcocks, and it's hard to imagine anyone in that position held in greater affection or respect. His memory of Boris Ord is a bit more conciliatory.
Well, I was frightened, very frightened by him before the war when I met him first. I went in for an organ scholarship in 1938, and he was very, very kind to me. I don't know why I was frightened, but he was an awesome personality. I found him to be very, very demanding, but I personally like that. I like to know what's required of me, then I do my best to try and fulfill that. Some people found it too much because he was sarcastic and he was rude, and he could be very, very strict indeed with the boys. I never realized why he needed to be quite so strict because he had a natural personality and people wanted to give of their best for him because they knew in their heart that he was wanting the best for the choir, not only for himself. He wasn't a selfish man.
And he got it, of course.
He got it, and he very, very rarely said that was good, because you assumed it was good if he didn't say that was bad.
An excellent technique when directing very young people in music making of the highest order. That could, of course, produce feelings of complacency, but I don't believe these have ever predominated. Pat McGee does remember a time when at least the traditional elements of the broadcast service were questioned.
After the war, we thought that the BBC wouldn't want to go on doing this, you see. But they said they did, and we said, oh, well, you don't want all 9 lessons, do you? Oh, yes, we do, they said. And so we took particular care about 1950-51. We were concerned that the structure of the thing is around the readings, and the music following should be a commentary on the readings. And we did it so thoroughly that, alas, it remained static for too long. And I can remember writing to David Willcocks and saying, oh, for goodness sake, we want a few changes. And I think he, in fact, knew exactly what to do about it. He kept the structure as it was, but he then proceeded to edit certain versions of well-known carols. And the thing was kept going, I think, through imagination.
On Christmas night, all Christians sing to hear the news the angels bring.
On Christmas night, all Christians sing to hear the news the angels bring.
News of great joy, news of great wealth.
News of our merciful King's birth.
The important thing in the minds of Eric Milner White and Daddy Mann when devising the service was the successful union of theology and music, as the carols must, as Pat McGee said, illuminate the lessons closest to them in the service. And it is, of course, very much a service with carols, not a carol concert with readings. That service was originally conceived as a gift from the college to the people of Cambridge, and was based on one devised from sources ancient and modern by Archbishop Benson for Truro Cathedral. Hilary Waymont, a chorister, a choral scholar, and a godson of Eric Milner White, remembers what sort of a man the dean was.
He was a chaplain in the First War, and as a matter of fact, I gather that he led his troops into battle on the Western Front, when all the officers had been killed, at the request of his men. And what happened next was that he was cashiered with one hand and given a DSO with the other. So he came back to King's before the end of the war, and that's why he was able to start the carol service 6 weeks after the armistice. He saw King's Chapel as a building which would take its part in a new movement in the church, and to some extent I think it did.
It certainly did in the Christmas festival. The 9 lessons and carols, as I said earlier, are used the world over as an unbeatable formula for recreating the Christmas story in words and music. How else could you start Christmas than with the sound of that lonely boy? Although, and here's a surprise for you, the first service at King's in 1918 did not begin with Once in Royal David's City. The first carol from King's was an exhortation, which reminds Christopher Barlow, who was a chorister at the time, of more earthly things.
Ding dong ding, ding a dong a ding, ding dong ding a dong ding. Art good Christian folk and listen how the merry church bells ring, and from steeple bid good people come adore the newborn King.
There was not a scrap of electricity in the whole chapel, nowhere. The entire lighting was by candles. There wasn't even a paraffin lamp in the place. The heating consisted of 2 hideous great stoves stuck away in the side corners of the antechapel. They certainly did take the chill off the building, but oh dear, I can remember now how bitterly cold Cambridge was in those days. How anybody ever played the organ in that place, I just don't know. The wind for the organ had to be provided by an old hydraulic engine, which made a delightful sort of banging noise in one of the side vestries, which you can't see from the chapel itself. We recognized that it was a new type of service, but the idea that it was going to go on, as it has ever since, never occurred to us.
Ding dong ding, ding a dong a ding, ding dong, ding dong, ding a dong, ding.
A mixed memory there of discomfort and joy, and it was only a year later that Ding Dong Ding was replaced by the now traditional opening. But the service has indeed gone on and been continually rejuvenated by directors of music with new ideas. Since Sir David Willcocks, there has been Philip Ledger, currently director of the Royal Scottish Academy of Music, and now Stephen Cleobury. Those directors of music have always been ably assisted by organ scholars, undergraduates whose job it is to provide organ music and accompaniment during the services every day, far removed from the choir, sitting alone, high up on the organ screen with no sight and only a distant sound of the choir itself. And that job becomes even more exposed on Christmas Eve, when the world is listening, and when one small slip will be recalled and recounted in the years to come. It's a tough assignment for a young student, as my own contemporary, Andrew Davis, now a distinguished international conductor, remembers.
Certainly it was the most pressure I'd ever felt in my life. I remember the first term I was up there having tremendous anxiety dreams about visions of the chapel burning down.
When you're sitting up there playing the organ, you're presumably completely on your own.
I usually had somebody up there to sort of keep me company and give me moral support. But yes, it is a very lonely business up there. And as you well know, it's the problems of the time lag between the organ loft and the choir are always extreme. And that's something one gets used to.
I think these days they have closed-circuit television and not saying relaying the beat.
Oh, do they really? How cheating.
I think you, probably in your day, you had to just rely on a sixth sense, didn't you? And
yes, one had to get used to a certain distance ahead of what one heard from the choir that one played, and it was curiously sort of unmusical in a sort of way, but it was an extraordinary discipline. It was extraordinary rhythmic discipline, I think, which stood me in good stead ever since.
And organists' reputations have been firmly established almost overnight. So it's a showplace for the choir, a shop window, dare I say, for an aspiring organist, and equally so for new music. Successive directors of music have made a feature of introducing new carols, and rightly so. Stephen Cleobury is no exception, and this year sees another new one.
A few years ago, we did a remarkably beautiful carol by Peter Sculthorpe, Morning Song for the Christ Child, and I thought it would be very nice to ask him to write something specifically for this service. And at the suggestion of the Dean, he chose a text by Henry Vaughan, "Awake, glad heart, get up and sing, it is the birthday of thy King." And I had the idea that since this was going to be a brand new carol for this year's service, that I would place it next door to Ding Dong Ding, which began the first carol service. I haven't quite had the courage to displace Once in Royal David City at the beginning.
So you value your life, I imagine,
that's
rather
right.
more than that.
So we'll do that, and then I'm going to place together these two carols, the first one that was ever heard and the newest one.
Peter Sculthorpe's new carol will certainly reach more ears than any other new carol this year by virtue of its place in this service, and the listening figures are added up in hundreds of millions the world over. One of the excitements for members of the choir comes in the new year, when they have the opportunity to read through the batch of letters which are sent every year by caring listeners. There used to be plenty in my day, and presumably there still are.
Oh, indeed, yes, we get many letters each year.
Do they all love it?
Not all, no. I've got one or two actually here in front of me that I thought you might be interested. Here's one that's very nice. Be nice if they were all like this. May I thank you very much indeed for the marvellous Christmas Eve service. You all sang like a choir in love. Fresh and musical, natural and heartfelt. What more could one ask? That's, of course, very encouraging to everybody, because we all need encouragement as well. But then you get something like this. I felt I must write to say how disappointed my family and I were with this year's Festival of Nine Lessons and Carols. In our opinion, and I venture to think that of many, many listeners, there were far too many generally unknown, tuneless and minor key carols. The majority of people greatly prefer the well-known items with the traditional descants.
It shows how much people care, though, doesn't it?
Of course, and everybody is quite entitled to their own opinion. I'm very interested to see what people think. Here's one on a slightly different subject. This is from Tenerife. although the singing is wonderful and brings comfort and joy, surely, to many thousands all over the world, the service is, in my opinion, always spoilt by people who seem to be continually coughing. It is actually a problem, that. I don't know if you've noticed it.
You never fail to notice it,
That's
certainly.
right. We do put in the programme a rubric asking people to realise that coughing does make a noise. So what tends to happen is that everybody saves up till the end of the carol, and then there's a kind of nervous reaction and everybody has a jolly good cough before the next one.
Well, the nation's health may not be the prime concern of peoples on the other side of the earth, although the sound of those chesty folk booming around the reverberant acoustic of King's Chapel is endured as far away as America and Australia, although the music and the service win through, even over the various time zones.
We listened to the program at 2 o'clock in the morning. Absolutely delightful. Tremendous depth of sound. The music was stirring. A wonderful way to start Christmas, even if we were a little drowsy at the time.
It's a marvelous thing. The thing I like best about it is being able to hear the congregation itself live and knowing it's going on at the same time that we're participating here.
While I was listening, I was thinking about all the different people all over the world who are listening to it, and probably all the different parties that are going on at the same time. I mean, we were sitting there drinking coffee at breakfast, but people in other parts of the world were probably eating lunch or having dinner. And there's something about that. It feels like one big worldwide family. It's very touching also at the beginning, listening to the one little boy sing all by himself. While I was listening, I was thinking, this feels like Christmas.
But does it feel like Christmas for young singing boys who can't be at home with the family? The choir school and the college organise parties for the choristers, but they do have to go on singing right through to Christmas Day. And on Christmas Eve, one of those boys has to be on his mettle at 3 o'clock in the afternoon as he begins Christmas for so many people. I asked Sir David Willcocks if the start of the service had always been the same.
I think it's changed in some ways, because I remember when Boris Ord was director of music, the poor boy who had to sing once in Royal David City had to start after a very indeterminate hum from Boris Ord, which sounded and what note it was very difficult to detect. And I, having an even worse voice, I think, than Boris Ord, elected to use a tuning fork, and I used to let the trusted chorister have the tuning fork. It was generally an A one, and he had to aim off and sing D, and they never let me down over that one at all. But one of the problems is, of course, that the organ at that time of year is very often a little out of tune because of the cold weather, and therefore it may not be exactly corresponding to the tuning fork.
Hazards indeed, and nothing more hazardous for the solo boy himself than wondering who's going to be chosen. The decision is made at the last minute, after the choir has processed to its starting point, not at the west end of the chapel as in the earliest broadcast, but under the organ screen. This year's head chorister, Richard Eatson, explains the selection process.
5 or 6 boys are practised, and there's usually a lady there with a red button that flashes off when Mr. Cleobury looks at that, and the organ just sort of slowly resolves around the finishing note, and you think, who's it going to be? Who's it going to be? And then Mr. Cleobury points at the person and beckons him to come forward. There are some sighs of relief, and then everyone stops and listens.
What Sweeter Music was presented by Brian Kay and produced by Caroline Elliott. And this afternoon at 3 o'clock the tradition continues as we broadcast the Festival of 9 Lessons and Carols live from King's College Chapel in Cambridge.